Sorry. Good afternoon. Welcome to Transatlantic Thursday. My name is Rodney Ford. I'm the cultural attaché at the U.S. Embassy to the Republic of Italy in Rome. Today we have with us Professor Jeffrey Stewart. Professor Stewart is going to talk to us today about New Negro Renaissance 2.0, from art to STEM. He's going to focus on the challenges and the success of African Americans in the STEM field. Following the presentation, Professor Stewart will answer your questions. At any point during the program, please ask your questions in Facebook comments or in YouTube chat. Following the Professor Stewart's presentation, we'll open up the floor to as many questions as we can get to. So Professor Stewart, I think everybody's seen some of his bio, but I'll hit a few of the highlights. Professor Stewart is a professor of Barbara, where he's been since 2007. His most recent book, The New Negro, The Life of Alain Locke, he'll be talking about. It came out in 2018, and we had the pleasure of welcoming Professor Stewart a couple years ago in person, and hopefully we will again. Comments prior to the program starting about the terminology of today's presentation. Using the word Negro. And, you know, as Professor Stewart starts, we spoke briefly before the program started, and he's going to talk about that. I think that's an inherent part of his presentation today. I think it's an inherent part of the book he wrote, of the research that he does. And so for those that are questioning the use of the word in today's presentation, Professor Stewart is going to address that directly. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Professor Stewart. Thank you so much for joining us today, sir.
Thank you so much, Rodney, and also the U.S. Embassy and the whole group of people in Rome who've made this presentation possible. I mean, this is kind of a dream come true in a sense that I was a Fulbrighter in 2003. And because of that, I think I've had a continuing relationship with Italy and the kind of knowledge that can be found there and shown there and experienced there. So I look at this as a kind of not so much just a presentation, but also an opportunity for dialogue. And so I hope that we can have some of that today. So I'm going to start off just with the title, The Promise of the New Negro 2.0. I think that's an important part in the sense that the New Negro was a term that was very popular in the early part of the 20th century as a revolutionary term. And so I really want to talk about that, the New Negro, not the Negro, but the New Negro. Let me just see if I can advance this. So for me personally, of course, what has been a great honor was that I was able to do this book called The New Negro, The Life of Alain Locke, and I got essentially incredible response for it. So I'm very humbled by that. I won the National Book Award, the Pulitzer Prize. But what I want to see is that in working on this, I really came to this title for a particular reason, because Locke, who was a Black philosopher, aesthete, and sometimes called the father of the Harlem Renaissance, advanced that notion of the New Negro as a transformative possibility among Black people in general. Of course, in the early part of the 20th century, the term Negro, particularly capitalized, was the preferred term. Even getting it capitalized was a struggle that W.B. Du Bois and others went through, just like now we're in the struggle to capitalize Black, which I think has been won, at least temporarily. But the thing about the New Negro was that it captured the possibility or the concept of regeneration. In other words, it's not just Negro, it's that there is a new Negro. And not just at one time, But I think Locke, through his study of African cultures and American cultures, saw the capacity for regeneration that was part of the Black identity. Sometimes he called it Afro-American. There were a variety of terms, but the new Negro captured that capacity to reinvent ourselves. In his case, primarily focused on the issue of Locke. So art was the thing that Locke really focused on. The art of the Black experience. So while I was really working on Locke and finishing this book, I discovered Benjamin Banneker. And it was kind of an interesting discovery because Locke in 1926 in The Nation about Benjamin Banneker, almost looking back to find a new Negro, someone who had reinvented himself through art and science before the 1920s. So that this gives us a sense that the new Negro is not so much a concept for Locke that was time-bound, but it was this capacity for regeneration and recreation through study and research and self-expression. And Banneker was one of those people that he found. So when I was doing work on Locke, I found this article in the archives, and I didn't really know what I was going to do about it. And then when I was at my former school, George Mason University, one of my colleagues took me to a place called the Benjamin Banneker garden or park. And in that park is a stone. And the stone is really like, I would say probably about, 2 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet, probably weighs about 200 pounds. I said, what's this stone? Well, Benjamin Banneker was selected at the time by people to survey Washington, D.C. And in the process of surveying, he was essentially one of the few people in the United States, which had just been formed, to actually had the skill as an astronomer, surveyor, to map out what is now the capital, District of Columbia. Because of course, that was one of the first things that the American nation had to do, was to create a capital. And of course, we know a lot of tension recently has been on the physical capital, but really the District of Columbia is actually supposed to be considered the capital. And it was Maryland and Virginia that ceded property for this, and it had to be surveyed. And you think about it, at this time, we're talking about the 1790s, very few people had that kind of knowledge. Well, Benjamin Banneker had that kind of knowledge because he was a self-taught astronomer. And so a man of, incredible talent, but self-taught. He was a free person. He was born free in Maryland, largely because his parents had fought and gotten their freedom. He owned 100 acres of land in Maryland. The picture, which is of his garden, is behind me in this presentation. So he had a freedom that 90% of the other African Americans at the time did not have. He had the freedom to farm his own land, to profit for it, but he also had the time to study and to choose what he wanted to do and to choose what was different from what other people, even in the 18th century, even in the Black Enlightenment, which is sometimes called the 18th century truth, he chose to study the heavens. And because of that, his skills and his friendship with the Ellicott family here portrayed on the right led him to get this commission. So he's actually one of the people who's responsible for laying out the capital of the new nation, which we now call the United States of America, a unique person in his time. Here's the stone marker that is there, because when they surveyed and found the areas that they wanted, then they dropped this huge stone down, and that stone was the marker, and there was 4 of them. He caused only one to be laid down before he returned to his home in Maryland. but that stone is still there. It's marking his presence, even though it's largely ignored and not very well understood in American history. So I'm now thinking about that stone in a sort of different way because of my time in Italy. You know, there's stones, right? And then there's rocks. And, you know, he dropped that stone down in the District of Columbia, but he also wielded a different kind of stone later on. Because while he was down in Alexandria, Virginia, largely doing the surveying, he found out that the man who had proposed him or recommended him for this commission, Thomas Jefferson, had actually written a book, privately distributed, but known, called Notes on Virginia. It was a sort of geographical, geological, natural history book about Virginia, written for Europeans who were curious about the new nation. But in the section on laws, Jefferson went off topic and went on what today would be considered a kind of rant about why Black people were not acceptable as citizens in the new nation. Because, of course, in the situation of laws, he was describing what was the laws, and ultimately he had to come up against the fact that there was a whole different set of laws for Black people in the new nation after it separated from Europe, I mean England. Then was, you know, they still had these laws, and people were asking, well, why are you having these separate laws? So he went in a rant essentially about how Black people were different and inferior, and used that as a justification for why they could never become part of the new nation and would have to be shipped out to some other country after they were emancipated. So I'm sure this was striking to Banneker. So he wrote a letter to Jefferson, who at that time was the Secretary of State. And he says, he starts out by, one of the really interesting things is he identifies himself as a Black person. He says, and I'm, you know, aware of the overall general prejudice toward our people, but I'm hoping that you are a person who will have more positive sentiments about him. Kind of ironic, obviously, because he knew that that wasn't the case, but he was using that as a device. And later on, after he did that letter, and there was an exchange, he then, you know, with that letter, he sent an almanac that he had been working on. An almanac that contained in it the calculations for the motions of the sun, moon, etc., tides. At that time, almanacs were becoming popular, particularly with farmers who needed to know the seasons and the moving of the tides. So he used his astronomical abilities to make various calculations. And so he sent this almanac in ephemeris with the letter to say to Jefferson, look, here's an example of what Black people are capable of. He didn't mention Notes on Virginia, but obviously he was answering what Jefferson had said. Of course, Jefferson, of course, you know, everyone knows, I guess, that he's the author of the Declaration of Independence with that famous line, we take these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet at this, you know, this view, however, contrasted with what he says, essentially, you know, 5 or 6 years later, almost the opposite, where instead of we are all endowed with, you know, inalienable rights, he's saying you, because you're different, don't have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness within the United States of America. The key thing here, though, is that Jefferson says in this litany of complaints about Black behavior, she says, comparing them faculties of memory, it seems to me that, yes, their memory is equal to whites, which is one of the reasons he wants to ship Black people out of the United States, because he says they will remember all of the horrible things that have been done to Black people, even at that time, from roughly, say, 1619 up to 1791, the litany of horrors, they'll remember that. So that's kind of bad, right, for Jefferson's point of view. But in reason much inferior, as I think one could scarcely be found capable of tracing and comprehending the investigations of Euclid. So I know that must have stung Banneker, right? Because, if you're creating, if you're putting out an almanac, if you're surveying the grounds of the District of Columbia, you have to understand basic geometry, right? So in his mind, this is what we would call a kind of frame clash. You're saying this, and yet you know me, right? Not only that, but when you start to go deeper into it and you say, okay, Euclid, where is Euclid? Euclid never lived outside of Egypt, which is in Africa. There's also a litany of complaints Jefferson has about Africans have never invented anything. You see? So here you begin to see that, wow, Jefferson's an educated person. He's throwing around Euclid. Does he not know that Euclid was essentially an African? Where did Pythagoras, for example, learn geometry? He learned it in Egypt. Pythagoras traveled to Egypt to learn more about mathematics and astronomy, not to actually have no knowledge of it. So, and plus the whole sense that, geometry is something that is just a fact in the West is completely problematic. China had knowledge of the Pythagorean theorem before Europe. But Jefferson obviously couldn't accept that. Not only that, Jefferson also knew about an enslaved African named Onesimus, who in 1721 had shared with Cotton Mather the technique of inoculation, by which you could prevent disease and smallpox during the smallpox epidemic in Boston. We right now are depending for our future survival on the vaccine, which was innovated by a man named Jenner about 50 years later. But it was based on the concept of inoculation, which was introduced into Western science by an African. We don't even really hear that talked about very much when we're all talking about vaccines. But this African did it, and it was controversial because Cotton Mather went and said, oh, we're gonna do this. And people said, no, we're not doing this. This must be one of these things these Africans are trying to use to kill us. And yet when one doctor was worried his son was gonna die, and he put a little bit of the tiny bit of the smallpox, which is different than vaccine, technically, especially the one now, but nevertheless, the principle was the same. It came from Africa, just like geometry comes from Africa. Yet, because somehow or other, Black people have no scientific knowledge, Jefferson said, I advance it only as a suspicion that they are inferior both in body and mind. And therefore, it's an obstacle for them being emancipated. You see, so this is not just theory here. This is leading to a programmatic, perpetual enslavement of Black people from 1791 all the way up to 1865, when Jefferson, of course, himself could have taken quite a different path that would have spared us, among other things, the Civil War. So Banneker a black man living alone, you know, as a free person in Maryland, writes this letter to the Secretary of State, who was an extremely powerful man, challenging him on the key assertions of this book. First of all, he attacks his anthropology. He says, the idea of difference, that we're inherently different, goes against the whole notion that there's one universal father who has created all of us the same. He doesn't mention it, but obviously he focuses on afforded us all the same sensations and endowed us with the same faculties. That's obviously a critique of what Jefferson is saying. So this is one of the things I'm working on in this new book on Banneker, is this concept of criticality. In other words, if you look at Black intellectuals, whether they are in the area of art, as Locke was, or in the area of Banneker, there is this mastery of the relevant information, but it's also using knowledge to question what is kind of the typical views, to use your mind to actually critique the formation that we're in right now, which actually gives it far more efficacy than simply just being a person who is coming to knowledge. You actually are an owner of knowledge and a user of your mind. The second element, which I think is very important, is that to be critical, he really is saying, I have to master a body of knowledge. The reason he was able to challenge Jefferson is because he could include that almanac. And there was an incredible number of calculations in that almanac. If Jefferson had been able to find a mistake in that almanac, you see, that would have undermined it. But he didn't. He didn't find a mistake in it. So he was a master of his knowledge. I think this is really important when we think about criticism a lot of times, that sometimes people are critical and, it's their opinion. But Banneker's notion of criticism was, I'm a master of a body of knowledge, and I'm going to use that knowledge to defend my people from abuse. For example, Banneker had done numerous astronomical drawings, one of which had predicted an eclipse. You see, so you couldn't really dismiss this, as of course was possible. The other thing is, Banneker creates his own perspective, his own vision out of that. I'm not just criticizing, I'm actually proposing some alternatives. America, he says, is a moral contradiction. Things. And he says, you rest satisfied short of the most active effusion of your exertions. In other words, you created this America that was supposed to be the city on the hill. That was the place that all beings could come and find a home, that would be better than Europe, that would be better than any other place, that would be a place of equality and justice. And yet, you stop once you've gotten that freedom, and you don't continue to push forward in it. Banneker was an example of what W.B. Du Bois, great philosopher in the 20th century, called the talented tenth, because not only is he creating this view, but he's also representing those who are not at the table. This is a particular quality of Black intellectuals and many other intellectuals, particularly today, feminist intellectuals and others, but it comes from this. He challenges Jefferson by saying, sir, when there was a time of your tender feelings for yourselves that led you to declare, that all people were equal, but sir, how pitiful it is to reflect that although you were so fully convinced of the benevolence of the Father of mankind and his equal and impartial distribution of rights and privileges, that you should at the same time counteract his mercies by detaining in fraud and violence so numerous a part of my brethren under the groaning captivity and cruel oppression, that you should at the same time be found guilty of that most criminal act which you professedly detested in others with respect to yourselves. This was obviously not the letter that Jefferson was looking for, because it's outing him and saying, at the time you're asking for freedom, you're the owner and abuser of slaves. The reason Banneker can challenge Jefferson is because he embodies the contradiction to the assertions that Jefferson is making. I could never find a Black who had mastered Euclid. Well, here I am. And here's my picture. He even says, I am of the darkest hue. So you can't play that game of saying, oh, well, you know, it's only when they mix with whites or whatever, because that was the thing that Jefferson and others used whenever there was a talented Black person. They try to find some way that it was traceable to whiteness. He said, no, I'm the darkest hue, and I'm an astronomer and a mathematician. How did Jefferson react? Well, you really, you know, Jefferson was cool about, you know, I thank you, blah, 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 for your letter. Nobody wishes to see such proofs as you exhibit of the talents are equal to those. Notice the word proofs. You know, this is another thing. You know, Black people always have to prove equality, when in fact, it's the opposite that should be proved, inequality. But anyway, he said, oh, you know, this is great. And I'm going to send a copy of your almanac to the French, who were the epitome of this, of learned societies. Unfortunately, searching of Jefferson's files and Cordyceps files finds no such letter from Jefferson. But later on, 1809, he said, oh, you know, the whole didn't amount to much. We know he knew spiritual trigonometry enough to make almanacs. Wait a minute, you said you never found somebody who knew basic geometry. But of course, he probably was helped, you see, by Ellicott, who was, of course, a white man. I have a long letter from him, which is some of the mind of very common stature. That's not true at all, because the letter was one of the more sophisticated letters that you can find written by an American in the 18th century. Why is that? Why is it that he can't change? Well, the reality is that Jefferson's freedom to be able to write the Declaration of Independence, to travel, to stop on the way to Philadelphia, people complain about Jefferson, and buy books, is because he had and owned over 250 slaves. And those slaves were not only people who made Jefferson's life possible, they actually made the success of the American Revolution possible. Because after the war with England had started, and the colonies were in desperate measure in trying to get cannon and ships and arms, the only thing they could trade outside of the British blockade that brought cash on the European market was tobacco. There's several people who have written about this hidden in the archives. Without the tobacco produced by enslaved Africans in Maryland and Virginia, there would have been no United States of America. So in a way, Jefferson knows that his existence is dependent on continuing a system that is a contradiction to what his words have said. Jefferson also, in addition to this, you know, all men created equal with the right of pursuit of liberty. You have a 1769 announcement of him chasing down a slave who has exercised his right to pursue happiness by running off. The problem, of course, is Banneker had no power, right, to force Jefferson to do anything. What did he do? He worked his farm of 100 acres in Maryland, farmed it on his own. I was able to visit there before the onslaught of COVID hit. He was a natural scientist in how he approached farming. He did not own any slaves. He created systems where this farm could be productive without having to be a monoculture, without having to just totally be dependent on tobacco. He created really an ecological system of production on his own. He also went on to publish the almanacs that he had sent to Jefferson, but this time, almanac being having astronomical data, tide tables, social commentary, but also the letter of exchange between him and Jefferson. See, he knew even then that he was going to be judged under race. So he used his ability to contest race to get his almanac published. So the almanac appeared and became very popular. The versions of it were printed in Baltimore, Philadelphia. He became one of the most successful authors, and it wasn't creative authorship like Phyllis Wheatley or some others. Very popular because it was this practical form of knowledge that Americans were very needy of. It was really the beginning of the scientific revolution in the United States, a new nation, and Banneker was at the forefront of it. So this comes back to this concept of the new Negro. When I was working on the new Negro initially, I was really focused on this idea that Locke saw art as an emancipatory platform. He thought protests and political and economic struggle was important, but he also thought that art was a way of kind of carrying out the argument for Black liberation in a different way. But he didn't, exclude science. Ernest Just, for example, the great biologist who was at Howard University, was one of his closest friends. And so now that we are essentially coming into, the 21st century, I use this thing of the new Negro 2.0 is saying that while art is still a huge part of our emancipation project, and we've, of course, been very successful at that in some ways, we can now add to that scientific efficacy, which has always been there, but has been kind of under the radar. As we didn't say, we watch a film like The Hidden Figures. Who knew that a Black woman and Black women were key to the success of the early space program? It's a hidden history that needs to become more visible in our larger culture. It's particularly important, I think, in the United States, where there's a huge shortage of talented people in areas like software and other developers. Places like Google and others are constantly saying we don't have enough people. There are 500,000 tech jobs in the United States that are unfulfilled, even at the same time that we have such unemployment. Technical training. There is a talented tenth that can be deployed in this way. All sorts of jobs could be filled if there was an aggressive approach to embracing the training of African-American youth in technical and scientific pursuits, perhaps inspired. But the thing I think is most important about this is that Banneker didn't just propose, oh, I want to become a surveyor or, whatever. In his almanac, he also used it as a place for political expression about what the new nation could be. And in there, he had a proposal. He said, when they were putting together the cabinet and everything, of course, we have now a Secretary of Defense, right? He said, maybe we should have a Secretary of Peace. Maybe the way for America to really distinguish itself from England, which at the time was the big issue, American nationalism, is to turn away from war. And in this, he kind of picks up on something that later on Walt Whitman would mention, is that there are Americans in all countries. There are people who love peace and equality and justice all over the world. Why should we be in conflict with other nations from the very get-go? Why shouldn't we use this as a new beginning for what nationalism means, which is to advance peace, not necessarily just to use it to advance our dominance? He also recommended having a universal education system whereby everybody in the United States would have a right to and access to education in the 1800s. Just imagine where we would be as a nation if someone had taken that proposal seriously, because he saw that many of the negative things that we talk about are actually in our culture and our people come from a lack of education. So These were just two proposals that he attached to the scientific, saying essentially that, yes, I'm a scientist. I want to be part of this, but I'm going to transform what it means to be a scientist because my Black experience tells me something about how science can be deployed in ways that are not good. And we see this today where Neil deGrasse Tyson did a book criticizing astrophysicists as lending their support to military. There's another path, perhaps, for astrophysics to take. Tyson is reminding us Banneker was trying to set us on that path in the 1800s, in the 1790s, and particularly about 5 or 6 almanacs that he produced at that time. And of course, we cannot forget Black Panther, which displayed how science and technology crafted by this Black woman here could be a source of liberation and self-determination for Black people. Anyway, that's my presentation for the New Negro 2.0. Thank you very much.
Professor Stewart, that was incredible. That was a very incredible talk. I mean, I think the thread you made from Banneker to Neil deGrasse Tyson, which I think, and that leads us into some questions, and we have a few questions that we'll start off with. And I think you address several of them, in your talk, but maybe we can go a little bit more in depth. And I think, one of the things that I think is of interest to you, and of interest to broader audiences, is with this background from Banneker to Neil deGrasse Tyson, there's still this lack of representation of African Americans in the field of science. And you address some of the ways that we can look into that. Are there some other, from an academic standpoint, some policy recommendations that we could look at that would one, and I think there's two aspects of it. One is getting African Americans and other minority groups interested in pursuing science, but also having the STEM and the science fields being more open to African Americans and other minority groups who would be interested in engaging in these subjects.
Yes. Well, that's very appropriate. Yes. So I think you're right. It is a two-pronged struggle. One is creating a pipeline so that the teaching of science in an interesting and creative way occurs very on in our school system, in elementary school, in junior high school. In the really in the sort of Black Power movement of the late 1960s and 1970s, there was an effort in this, sometimes among people who were called Afrocentrics, to essentially take elements of how the Black community operates and think of them mathematically and scientifically to sort of interest people in going into these fields. I think a lot can be done with this. One of the things that's coming out of this for me is I'm trying to launch what I call the Benjamin Banneker Project to teach the history of Banneker in high schools and get young people access to come to places like UC Santa Barbara during the summer or whatever to interest them. We have a grant from the National Science Foundation to create a quantum foundry. And we're trying to create a situation where students can come and learn about quantum physics at UC Santa Barbara. So that's one thing. But I also think the other part of it is educating those in the science community about the value of the kind of innovations that exist within the Black community. You see, because I think part of the bias of somebody like Jefferson is that sort of thinking that we're coming as seekers of knowledge rather than bringers of knowledge. And that's why I put in Onesimus there as a sort of clear kind of example that the African tradition is rich with scientific innovation. We spend a lot of time talking about the musical innovations that come from Africa, but there's science innovations as well. Those need to be studied and explored. It's also part of a kind of bias in Western science in general, which, has typically ignored not only Black science, but also the science that comes from indigenous peoples. And now that we're on the cusp of, a worldwide climate collapse, in which the Earth's existence is, held in balance. Some of the things that African American and indigenous people have innovated in terms of science could be very useful. The garden, how to create gardens, how to create sustainable ways of life that are more sustainable than the one we perhaps are so infatuated with in the United States of, extreme commodity consumption. We need to look at those cultures, African cultures, West Indian cultures, African American, indigenous cultures, as knowledges, not just simply, sources of gifts from Western science.
I thought another aspect of your talk was quite interesting and well, and that's the medium for addressing these issues. And I think one, beginning with Banneker and his writing, letters both with Jefferson, but also publishing his works as an example through Locke, publishing his work in Du Bois and having these conversations. And I think you address this a little bit in the talk, of Hollywood, whether it be Black Panther, whether it be movies like Hidden Figures, as a way to maybe not normalize, but to bring to the forefront of challenging people's subjectivity of what a scientist looks like, or what a hero looks like, or what these people look like. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of some of your research that, one, the medium of presenting it, but also presenting it in it's positive, but it's also a way of saying, look beyond the person who's delivering, look at what it is that they're delivering.
Yeah.
Whether it's helping to put a man, in space on the moon, or whether it's innovating and creating technology.
Well, I think that's our basic struggle, isn't it? Various people keep saying that. Jefferson even said that, it's not what we look like, it's that we're all created equal with the same rights. King said it, the content of the character, not the color of the skin. But I think it's actually a quality of the West, particularly, focused so much on perception and how people look and what they bring. That's really an important obstacle for us. So something like Hollywood, which is really all about, manipulating our perception, is quite useful. And, that Hidden Figures is just such an astounding film because it makes visible the invisible. I have to confess that before I saw that film, I didn't really think about, or maybe I had heard it at some point, but think about that computers, the use of the word computer wasn't at first a mechanical device. It wasn't an IBM. It was a person. It was those women who were there making all those calculations. And then you see, I can't remember the name of the woman who's the sort of head of that group, who sees the computers and says, oh, I have to, essentially master how to run these computers. And then when she's in there and she's studying that huge IBM, the men come in and say, well, what are you doing in here? But then when they go to try to run the computer, they can't run the computer. You see, they need her. And I guess what I would say right now is we need everybody helping us to deal with this. I don't think we really have maybe COVID is the beginning of us recognizing that the Earth is essentially, hanging in the balance. Our very existence on Earth is hanging in the balance, and we need everybody involved, and we need to get beyond this sense of because of difference, which does exist, you can't be at the table. Certainly, Black Panther did a lot, I think, in the sense that it showed a example of, again, a Black woman who was the scientist, who was the theorist, who was the innovator, the technologist. And I think that's another thing sometimes we have to struggle against, is the way in which gender can confuse us about who has the knowledge and who can deliver it.
Thank you so much. One of my colleagues reminded me it's Dorothy Vaughan was the head of that section.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes.
No, that's fine.
Yeah. No, I mean, and her role is so strong in, again, criticality. She's overtly critical of how things are being organized, but she's measured and strategic in how she uses that criticality. In that sense, she reminds me a little bit of Banneker.
I think it's that, but it's also like the very evident competence in being able to do your job. And I think that may be one of the things that helps people to begin looking beyond, whatever your gender or whatever your ethnicity is, and saying, is this person competent? Can they get the job done? Is really where we want to get. So just, as we're moving along, I'd just like to encourage our viewers to ask questions. We have time for several more questions, so please don't hesitate. I think there's been some debate on whether this could have been in Italian or English. I mean, I think it's these are some concepts that are they're probably not very always easy to understand in your second language. So,
well, I think it's important to address that when you look at African American history, you see that there's been changing terms used over time, and that's very valid. A certain kind of consciousness emerged in the 1960s that led to the use of the word Black. Later on, African American. African American was actually really picking up something that was quite prevalent early in the 20th century. And the new Negro sounds strange because, there's the word Negro in it. But the new Negro was actually used in the 1950s and early 60s to capture this idea of reinvention. So that's really the reason that I put that in there, because it kind of goes with Renaissance, which is rebirth. So I can understand that it may seem anachronistic, but part of what I was trying to capture is that this notion of the Renaissance hasn't actually just started today. It has a history. And one of the things I believe is that the current, say, Black Renaissance, which people are talking a lot about, actually began in the 1920s, and that we're still in the Renaissance. It didn't end in 1929 with the stock market crash, as some people argue. I think it's expanding. So it's good to remember where things began, and that's part of the reason I chose that title.
Thank you. And maybe we can bring that a little bit back to Locke, because I think one of the factors that I've understood is that it's a major factor about identity. And I think particularly in an American context that, we have, we don't call them, we call them broadly European Americans, but we have Italian Americans or French Americans or German Americans or Irish Americans or whatever. And the African American experience in particular is that, African Americans don't know where they come from. So it becomes a generic term. And so using a term like Negro or using whatever becomes a collective, that it's a collective experience. Even if you're, Black person from Africa or Europe, as a Negro, you can understand what that experience means. And I think that's some of a lot of the Harlem Renaissance, and a lot of the things I think that Locke was talking about are related to that as an identity. Can you talk a little bit about that and some of that thread through Locke?
Yeah, I mean, because I remember Malcolm X's critique of Negro, and I mean, he basically said, I think a lot of that transition came out of his critique, which is that, the Negro was a sign that one didn't know where one came from. Okay. He said, Black people in all over the world, no one calls themselves Negro except those in the United States. So he was very critical of that. James Baldwin, in various debates with him, said, well, I'm not that concerned about that. What I'm concerned about is the person inside the term and what we're doing about that. So in the early part of the 20th century, to call somebody, there were people who used Black, particularly Marcus Garvey and some others, but most people who were educated African Americans shied away from the term Black. At the same time, there was also this sense that Negroes were talked about in a certain way in the media. You talked about that. So the term the new Negro came up to distinguish from the essential stereotype of Black people that was generated largely during the Jim Crow period. The idea that we were dependent, that we were wards on the nation, that we were dying out. There were all these predictions about that. Young people in the 1890s, early 1900s began to call themselves New Negro. They were saying basically that I'm not handicapped, let's say, I'm to use another antiquated term, I'm not held back by the fact that my ancestors were enslaved. I actually have the power to define myself now by my current actions and behaviors. So that's why in this period of the, say, 1870s to 1890s, you have an incredible number of Black businesses that are established. You have Black people who are going into political and economic and social things. You have companies, you have the emergence of Tuskegee Institute, where essentially all kinds of studies of science are going on, the emergence of HBCUs. Those were all examples of what at the time would be called New Negro efficacy. And when people said, I'm a New Negro, like, say, Langston Hughes or Zora Neale Hurston being identified with those terms, it was that I'm an independent force in American culture that can create something beautiful and powerful through my own efficacy. It's really a term of proactivity in the midst of a situation of incredible terror and frustration. When I think about the Harlem Renaissance and Locke at Howard University, I think about the race riot in Washington in 1919, where whites rioted and tried to destroy the Black community. We hear a lot about the Tulsa riot, which of course was far more horrific. But that whole idea of pushing people back who were moving forward. The riots occurred because people are moving forward. They were a response to the New Negro. But as the Messenger and others said, I should have included that in my presentation. It said the New Negro was fighting back. And that was that poem by Claude McKay, talking about the fact that in 1919 in Chicago, Black people fought back when whites attacked them. So New Negro was a source of pride and assertion and the capacity for reinvention through my own current present efficacy. And that's really what I'm trying to hold on to. Not so much Negro, but that New Negro, is these to like make people aware that at least that term, it's not so much that term as what it makes available to us. The capacity that even in desperate times, we have the capacity to create a whole new world for ourselves, regardless of how others dismiss it, like Jefferson did with Banneker. Even though Jefferson was dismissive, Banneker went on and produced these almanacs that were published all through the Eastern, well, essentially the colonies.
Now, thank you. I'm sorry. That brings us to, I think we'll have our last question, which I think is very relevant to what you were just talking about. We had one of our Facebook viewers, Livia Bellardini, asked a question, and she was saying, if you think that there's a reason for kind of the bringing to the foreground of arts over STEM as a means of regeneration of Black identity in the 21st century. And she's specifically talking about the significance of poetry employing the lyrical I in the revolution it implies by saying, look at me. And this reminds me of Amanda Gorman and her performance at the inauguration of why perhaps sometimes the arts does seem to come to the forefront, because it seems to be more representation of the person and the identity.
Yes, well, I agree totally. And I appreciate that reminder, because the key form of art, poetry. If you go back and read The New Negro, an interpretation, which I'm going to be republishing with Professor Henry Louis Gates with Oxford in a new edition in 2021. His original 1925 New Negro, poetry is first, okay? Because poetry is a place that is kind of the crucible of the revolutionary imagination. I think that's his sense of it. And so that's what you saw on display. What you saw on display with Amanda Gorman was not only her brilliance, but the fact that over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, many of the people who have won the National Book Award in poetry, the people who won the Pulitzer Prize in poetry, have been African American. Elizabeth Alexander, who was there, who did with Barack, okay? Maya Angelou. There's a very powerful tradition, particularly in Black women, and of queer people, queer poets, queer Black poets, who have really made this statement. But what was very significant, I think, about Amanda Gorman's presentation and her poem and the reading of it was that, to your point, for the vision that Biden was trying to embody better than Biden did in his inauguration speech, you see? So that's the power. It's not only that she was asserting her identity, she was actually asserting the identity of America against those who were trying to destroy it. She expressed that. And that's another thing about Banneker, is that Banneker wasn't, an Afrocentrist. He wasn't a Black nationalist. He was saying America can be better. America can be the beacon of peace. America can be the missionary of education for the world. I think we're in a moment now where what we're beginning to see is how much of a probative, powerful force in the reconstruction of America Black art and science can be.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's critical, and I think it's also it's integral. I mean, to what and who America is. If you have time, Professor, we actually have a few more questions from
sure, no problem.
From audience. One of the questions that had to do around work with in the educational field, and a large group who feel that it's important to talk about and include racial justice. And so the question is, how can we evolve from racial perception to focusing more on equity?
Yes, well, that's it's an old, I'm gonna date myself now. That's just what they used to call a $64,000 question. Of course, $64,000 now doesn't seem that much. But yes, equity. That's part of the American creed, and yet it's always something that seems to elude us. I will say that, you can't have equity without acknowledging the history of inequity. You see, this is where the racial justice program is very important. Some people say, oh, well, let's just get around this. Let's just forget about that and all come together. You can't come together if there's something that's actually dividing you. You can't, if you have, as James Baldwin used to say, he said, if there's something in the room that everybody knows is in the room that is destructive and they don't talk about it, after a while, they won't be able to talk about anything. We have to talk about these things that have divided us, but we also have to keep in mind that the goal is a stronger, more powerful unity. Not that unity will eliminate diversity or difference. And I think here we have to deal with, gender difference, sexual difference, the way in which, for example, today, trans Black people are some of the most demonized and attacked people in the United States. I mean, we have to have the same way of dealing with everybody, and equity is the path to inclusion. But if you don't treat people equally, you can't include them, because what you're saying is leave your history, leave your identity at the door. And that's not going to work for us anymore. And I don't think it really has worked for us in the past.
That's very correct. When one of my colleagues just raised, and we actually had a speaker, it must have been the end of 2019, maybe early 2020, that came and spoke about, he specifically intelligence, and it's feeding in. And it's, that particularly like Black women, I think minorities in general, but I think Black women in particular are discriminated in with AI because it almost doesn't even recognize minorities within artificial intelligence. Like the default is white and whiteness, and then men probably in particular within AI. But another question we had.
Can I speak to that just for a second? I think
no, absolutely, please do.
I think that our artists, there's a Black woman artist, A.M. Dark at UC Santa Cruz, who I'm in conversation with, who's specifically going after the way in which the algorithms that are used in artificial intelligence and games have this built-in bias. And one of the reasons they have it is because the people making the algorithms and making the games are not diverse, right? I mean, that's the contribution of diversity. And it's kind of stupid because if you think about it, when you're making a game, you would think you'd want everybody to buy it. But if you have encrusted in it, the denigration of certain people, they're not stupid. Gamers are some of the most intelligent and astute observers of media there are. They're going to see it, they're not going to buy it. So again, our biases are actually even holding back the obsession with world capitalism, right? So I think, that's really important. Every step we make, we carry what our past is with us. And so if we don't interrogate that past, we will continue to repeat it in the future.
It's like a grand 12-step program, right? I mean, you first have to recognize you have a problem before you can deal with the problem. And I think a lot of it is, and you're absolutely right, a lot of the talk is, slavery was so long ago. And I think some of the more recent talk about, Jim Crow, segregation, I was like, that's a people's lifetime, right? I mean, it's not like it was that long ago that we're talking about these things. How can we forget them if we're ever going to move ahead?
And just excuse me, Michelle Alexander has shown that Jim Crow is not in the past.
Yeah.
It's in the American prison system.
Absolutely. That's built in from the beginning.
Yeah.
We had one more question on on the Biden presidency, and I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk about it as the Biden-Harris presidency. And I think even President Biden is intentionally included Vice President Harris in not just in his policymaking process, but I think in the way that he talks about his administration. And the question is the person thinks that the administration will improve conditions for Black Americans regarding discrimination, and they wanted your take on that. And I think it's if we look at it in a construction of of real policy, but I think it's also in how we talk about it. You know, how we talk about the issues around race and ethnicity. And I think you about LGBTQ, about these issues that are very real parts of our society. And, you know, maybe perhaps what is the role of the president in talking about that? And, you know, how we look at the presidency, how we look at our own government, what is the role that plays broadly in society?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what we learned from the Obama presidency is just what probably somebody like Cornel West would say, symbolic blackness, or, you know, black people, you know, black faces in high places alone will not do it. So while it's extremely important for us to be able to look at the White House and see her, we also know from, you know, experience that Obama had, that every step forward is there's going to be a pushback. And so what we do, I think, is come up with, I think this is something that Black intellectuals have to do, Black artists have to do. It's not like that's your only job, but I think part of being this tradition that I'm talking about, you have to, that really is beginning, not beginning, because it was also there with Phyllis Wheatley, but certainly epitomized in this letter. We have to keep pressure on those in power to deliver. You know, it really is Black people, beginning with Clyburn in South Carolina, who decided on Biden. And there's an intellectual and political intelligence in the Black community that is largely usually dismissed. But a whole group of people who were Black in South Carolina decided that Biden would have the best chance of winning. And they put their votes there, and then throughout that became it became a reality. So now Biden has to do something, because he would not be president if it wasn't for Black people choosing him at an early stage when his campaign, you know, was essentially, you know, non-existent. So what do we do? How do we use the best minds in HBCUs, in Black universities, in the arts, in the sciences, to help move the community together? Because the reality is educated Black people, many of us have completely different life experiences and chances than working class and lower class Black people. And this has been accentuated by COVID. You know, Black people are suffering in the United States right now. So how are we going to reinvent the American economy so that it's more equitable, and the American educational system so it's more equitable, so everyone has a chance? I think that's really the major challenge for them. And also, in doing that, not forget the fact that class is such a factor in the United States that we're seeing large numbers of Latinx, Asian Americans, and white Americans who are now suffering because they've been left behind. So what is it in the Black experience and the Black knowledge factory that can help the Black community, but also at the same time help the entire American community move beyond this disastrous path where we're always fighting one another, and actually find a way to help one another? And I think the Black tradition has that capacity, has that knowledge. It's just been somewhat suppressed.
Okay, we have one more question. I think this is a very interesting one because it ties quite a few things that we've been talking about. This comes from Kiara Greeley, and it's about, I think we see it played out, I think certainly in Hollywood and television a little bit, but probably maybe also in the sciences, and it's this the question is about helping people to understand this is non-American, so this is in the Italian context, this kind of this construct of this, like, kind of the white savior, the paternalistic, you know, even when you sometimes now you have movies and you have main Black characters, it becomes like the white person who, you know, who saves them, or, you know, it's not a complete like standalone, you know, person who does something, but there's this paternalistic white person who like helps the black person, or it's not fully on their own. I think this comes a little bit to some of the things that you were talking about.
Yes, well, you know, that's why I think Black Panther was such a breakthrough. And it's like we haven't really been able to follow that up, right? I mean, because it was a movie essentially about a Black conflict, almost like a family conflict, that mainly Black people. The white people were considered, you know, external factors largely. I remember that great scene where the man they've rescued and brought back to life sneaks up on the woman and she said, "Watch out, colonizer." You know, so she labels him as, you know, an outsider. The thing about him is that he doesn't take offense at that. He knows it's true, you see. But that had a huge white viewership, okay, because it was so well done. And the story was one of being able to liberate yourself and maintain your independence through your knowledge and your courage, which was, you know, epitomized by the Black Panther character. His courage, even when he was facing stronger adversaries, his courage came through. His sense of justice came through. So I think, yes, the traditional model is that in order to have the white audience, this is what's driving these things always. You know, Black people, you know, white people will say, well, you know, I'm an older white guy. Why should I be interested in this? So then you put the white character in there and you give them a role to help Black people. But the reality is a truer history would be showing Black people helping white people. That's actually the movie that needs to be shown, because if you look, even in a movie like, you know, a terrible racist movie like, you know, Gone with the Wind, it's the Black people who are helping her hold on to her plantation. You know, I mean, even though she's mean to them and dismissive, they're the knowledge centers for her. If we could acknowledge that, I think it'd be a little easier for America. If America actually looked at Black people as a resource, not some sort of burden or obligation or something to be taken care of or fixed, really what Black people usually need is the boot off of your back. I think, but yes, there's a lot of room to creating the new cinema, and some of it's being done. I think, like, but you know, especially I think in the area of Netflix, and not to give them too much over Amazon Prime, but the television series, the Netflix series, I think those are exploring this much more. Where the relationship between Black people and white people is being negotiated on screen rather than brought from our imagination in some past situation onto the screen. The screen itself can be a place of negotiation and of creation of a
That's
new.
That's fascinating, because, you know, one of the people who's done an exceptional job of that has been Shonda Rhimes, and I think,
yes,
you know, her most recent series is Bridgerton. And I've not had a chance to see it, but it's gotten really good reviews. And it really challenges the way people think that this, you know, that they have, you know, Black people who are in this Regency England kind of environment atmosphere, and it's like, you know, people are like, well, this guy, he was supposed to be a blue-eyed guy. How do you have a Black person playing that? Or, you know, the conceptual idea. I guess a couple of years ago they were talking about Idris Elba maybe playing James Bond, and people were like, you know, angry. Like, you know, it's a fictional character. Why can't a Black person or a woman play James Bond? I mean, what? There's, you know.
Yeah, I think the reason that comes up is because the creation of that character is part of especially for the British, a kind of symbol of, you know, their attempt to hold on to empire, right? I mean, in other words, the James Bond figure is, you know, really important at a time when, you know, America is kind of hegemonic and dominant. So, you know, if he's also going to be Black, it's like, you know, what do we have left? I think that idea of decline
is really important emotional thing for places like England and America. And you have to realize that's a very powerful emotion for many people. And that's why I like the concept of Renaissance, you know, because Renaissance usually occurs after some decline. After the Black Death, we can reinvent and repurpose ourselves if we can turn our attention away from the distractions toward what's essential, which is our collective survival.
I think that is the perfect way to end this week's program. Thank you so much for I could talk to you for all afternoon, but thank you so much for taking your time, for waking up so early on the West Coast, and you know you're starting your day as we're winding ours down, and I really appreciate
it. Sorry the sun invaded during the presentation, but that was a reminder, right?
No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you so much, Professor Stewart. It really has been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for having me.
You know, this is a reminder to
you and everyone, and Maria and everyone.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that. And just a reminder to our viewers that we will have another program next week in continuation of Black History Month. And if you have some additional questions, please hold on to them, and we'll try to get to them next week. So thank you and all the best. Buonasera a tutti. Ciao.
Bye-bye.